I don't tell this story at parties. I don't tell it to first dates, or to coworkers, or to anyone who looks like they sleep well at night. I tell it rarely, and when I do, I watch the person's face very carefully, because there's always a moment, usually around the middle, where their expression changes, where the smile fades, where they realize I'm not building toward a punchline. This is that story. It started with milk. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like nothing, like the beginning of a grocery complaint, not a confession. But that's exactly why it worked. That's exactly why it went on as long as it did. Because the beginning of something genuinely wrong almost never announces itself. It doesn't arrive with sirens or slamming doors. It arrives as milk. I had bought a full carton on a Monday. I remember because I always shop on Mondays. It's a habit I picked up when I moved into that apartment. My first time living completely alone. Third floor unit, end of the hallway, one bedroom, one bathroom, a kitchen that got good morning light, and walls thick enough that I never really heard my neighbors. I liked it quiet. I had chosen it specifically because it was quiet. By Wednesday, the carton was already half gone. I stood at the open refrigerator and stared at it for a long moment. I'd had maybe 2 cups of coffee. I did the math without really doing the math, the way you do when something feels slightly wrong, but your brain is already working to explain it away. I must have used more than I thought. I must have poured too much and not noticed. I closed the refrigerator and went to work. The following week, I bought 2 cartons. Told myself I'd been drinking more coffee lately. Told myself the cold weather made me want it more. By Friday, they were both gone. I stood in my kitchen at 11 o'clock at night holding an empty cardboard container, and I felt not fear, not yet, but a kind of static. The way the air feels just before a storm arrives. Something mildly, quietly, inexplicably wrong. I told no one. I started noticing other things after that. Small things. Things that each individually had a perfectly reasonable explanation. My bathroom mat was facing a slightly different direction. Not dramatically, maybe a few centimeters, maybe a quarter turn to the left. I stared at it for a moment, then straightened it, then went about my morning. A few days later, it was off again. I began sleeping with the television on. I told myself it was for the noise. I'd always liked a little background sound when I slept, nothing unusual about that. The shower drain was clogging more often than it used to. I bought drain cleaner. I used it twice in 1 month. One evening I came home and genuinely thought for one sharp moment that I could smell something. Not a bad smell, not rot or garbage or anything alarming. It was almost domestic. Like someone had recently been in a warm space, like body heat barely there, fading as I stood in the doorway and held my breath to listen. The apartment was silent. Of course it was silent. I put my keys on the hook, took off my shoes, and made dinner. The door to my storage closet was in the hallway between the bathroom and the bedroom. It was a deep closet, deeper than you'd expect from the outside, the kind of architectural quirk that older buildings sometimes have. I kept it locked mostly out of habit, with a small key I'd hung on a hook inside the kitchen cabinet. One afternoon, I went to find a sweater from one of the winter boxes. I went to the cabinet, the key was there. I unlocked the closet, pulled open the door, and then stood very still. Nothing was dramatically out of place, nothing was overturned or ransacked, but the boxes, my own boxes labeled in my own handwriting, were stacked differently than I had left them. One of them had been moved closer to the back wall. The arrangement had shifted, subtly, the way things shift when someone has moved them and then carefully tried to put them back. I stood in that doorway for a long time. I told myself I'd forgotten how I'd stacked them. I told myself it was nothing. I pulled out the sweater, locked the door, and put the key back on its hook. But that night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time, I let myself ask the question I had been refusing to ask for weeks. What if the explanations I was giving myself were wrong? I didn't sleep that night. I lay there and listened to the apartment the way you listen to something you've stopped trusting. Every sound took on a different quality. The building settling, the pipes moving, a faint, irregular rhythm from somewhere above me. My upstairs neighbor, I'd always assumed, shifting in their sleep, moving furniture, living their life directly above my ceiling. Except I didn't have an upstairs neighbor. I was on the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor was the top. I had known that. I had always known that. I had signed the lease knowing that. Had thought of it as a selling point. No footsteps above me, no creaking in the night, and yet somehow I had spent weeks hearing sounds from above and filing them neatly under upstairs neighbor without ever once catching the contradiction. I sat up in bed at 2 a.m. and I counted every small wrong thing from the past 2 months. The milk, the mat, the drain, the smell, the boxes, and I felt them assemble into something I didn't want to look at directly. I called the building manager first thing the next morning and asked a simple question. I asked if anyone else had access to my unit. There was a pause. Then he said, the maintenance team had a master key, of course, but they'd been in only once for a routine inspection 6 months ago before I moved in. There had been a long-term tenant, a man who'd lived there for almost 4 years. He'd left abruptly, some kind of personal crisis. They'd changed the locks after he left. They said they had changed the locks. I called a locksmith that same afternoon. The locksmith arrived, looked at my door, and told me something that made the floor feel like it shifted under me. He said the lock was original hardware, old, the kind that had been on the door for years. No sign of recent replacement, no new installation. They had never changed it. I had moved into an apartment with a lock that a previous tenant still had the key for. I want to pause here because I need you to understand what that felt like. Not the fear. The fear came later when I was safe, when there was distance between me and that apartment. What I felt in that moment, standing in my own hallway while the locksmith worked, was something stranger than fear. It was a total reconfiguration of the past 2 months. Every morning I had showered and gone to work. Every night I had gone to sleep in the dark. Every meal I had eaten alone at my kitchen table. And the entire time, the picture I had of my life, a solitary, quiet life, had been wrong. In some way that I still don't fully understand, I had not been alone. The locksmith replaced the lock. He left. I stood in my newly locked apartment, and I didn't feel safer. I felt like a person who has just been told in clear and technical language exactly how long they were unknowingly in danger, and who must now sit with that number. I called the police. I told them what I suspected. I told them about the small things, the sounds from above, the lock. They sent 2 officers. They searched the apartment with me. The rooms, the closets, under the bed, the bathroom, everywhere. They found nothing. No one. They were kind. They told me to document anything unusual and call again if I felt unsafe. They left. I was alone. I went to the storage closet one more time. I unlocked it, opened the door, and really looked at the back wall. It was paneled. Dark wood paneling, original to the building, with a seam down the center that I'd always assumed was just decorative, just aesthetic. I walked to the back of the closet. I put my hand on the seam. I pushed gently. The panel shifted inward. Behind it was a space, not large, not a room. A gap maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep running along the back wall of the building. There was a sleeping bag, folded tightly, a flashlight, a water bottle, a small stack of books, and a single empty carton of milk. I moved out of that apartment inside of 48 hours. I didn't take everything. I left behind the furniture, most of the kitchen, the things I couldn't carry quickly. I slept at my sister's house for 3 weeks. I didn't tell her why, not really. I said there'd been a maintenance problem. She didn't push. The police found him eventually. He was the former tenant, the man who'd lived there for 4 years before me. He'd left, but he hadn't entirely left. He'd known about the gap behind the panel because he was the one who'd made it. He'd been going and coming through a door in the alley that led to an external access point in the building's old service corridor. He'd been in and out while I was at work. He was, the police used this word carefully as though trying not to alarm me further, present on a number of occasions while I was home, while I was asleep. He was charged. There was a case. I gave a statement. I don't know everything that followed because I made the deliberate decision to know as little as possible. I have a new apartment now. I personally watched the locksmith install every lock. I know every sound this building makes at night. I cataloged them in the first week like a person conducting a scientific study, naming each one, assigning it a source, deciding whether it was normal. The radiator, the pipes, the couple next door, the man upstairs who works late and comes home at midnight. I sleep reasonably well now most nights, but I still check the closet before bed. I still run my hand along the back wall. I can't stop myself. It's ritual now, like checking that the stove is off or the door is locked. My hand moves to that back wall and presses, gently. And every night, when it doesn't move, when it holds firm and solid like a wall is supposed to, I exhale, and I try to remember that the feeling of safety and the fact of safety are not always the same thing. That sometimes the life you think you're living alone is not quite the life you're living, and that the most frightening thing about that is not the danger itself, but how long it can exist in your quiet, ordinary days before you think to look. I still sleep with the light on.